1879, a packed Boston courthouse. Alexander Graham Bell's lawyers produced a scrunched-up letter. It had been fished out of a waste paper basket. It was from Elisha Gray to Bell. I do not, however, claim even the credit of inventing it, as I do not believe in a mere description of an idea that has never been reduced to practice should be dignified with the name invention. Oh my God! Western Union's lawyers gasped. If there was ever proof that Elisha Gray had not invented the harmonic telegraph, this was it. Welcome to this episode of Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. My name is Jamie Dobson. In the previous episode, we heard the remarkable story of the Scotsman Alexander Graham Bell, who defied all the odds to invent the harmonic telegraph and to submit his patent application on the 14th of February 1876. What happened in the build-up to that patent application? That is what we're about to find out in this episode as we bring the second part of this story to a stunning and very sad conclusion. Let's recap the story so far. Alexander Graham Bell fell in love with one of his students, Mabel Hubbard. Gardiner Hubbard, her father, was a thorn in the side of William Orton's Western Union. He was a telegraph reformer. Very importantly for this story, he was also a powerful and well-connected patent attorney. This is what happened in the build-up to that 14th of February patent application. Hubbard had heard on the grapevine that Elisha Gray was preparing a submission to the patents office. This was the real reason why, in a panic, he gathered all of Alexander Graham Bell's notes and diagrams and packaged them together in what can be fairly described as a half-baked patent application. It doesn't matter which historian you read. Shulman, for example, is critical of Alexander Graham Bell, whereas Charlotte Gray is extremely sympathetic. Both of those historians are in agreement. Gardiner Hubbard was a cheat. Once he had the notes gathered up, he delivered them to the patent office by hand. This is, of course, a vital piece of information because it means there was no timestamp on the envelope from the post office. According to Shulman, Gardiner Hubbard bribed a patent officer to date and stamp the half-baked application to say that it arrived a few hours before Elisha Gray's. Yes, you heard that correctly, because on the 14th of February 1876, in what can only be described as the most remarkable coincidence in the history of invention, Elisha Gray submitted a patent application for the harmonic telegraph only 4 hours after Alexander Graham Bell's arrived. 10 days later, Hubbard was at it again. This time he bribed a patent examiner, and the examiner showed Alexander Graham Bell Elisha Gray's submission. Most importantly of all, Alec took a look at the component that converted sounds into electrical signals. This was the diaphragm and the pin dangling in an electrified solution, and this was the component, the thing that changed sound to an electrical signal that had been giving Thomas Watson and Alexander Graham Bell so much grief. And then, of course, according to this alternate version of history, Alexander Graham Bell scribbled in his patent application the key component that would make the harmonic telegraph work, and then it got quickly and quietly filed away in the patent office. He then returned from Washington to Boston and miraculously sketched the diaphragm and the pin into his notebook. He then set up the experiment where he spilled the battery acid on himself. And by the way, if you don't believe me, take a look at Elisha Gray's diagram on Wikipedia and compare it to Alexander Graham Bell's. They are almost identical. And so the coincidences are really stacking up. An identical device sketched identically. So it's not just that they were the same thing, the drawings were the same thing as well. They were both submitted to the Patents Office on the 14th of February, but one of them was delivered by hand. If this sounds unbelievable to you, well, don't worry, it also sounded unbelievable to William Orton of Western Union, it sounded unbelievable to Thomas Edison, and it sounded completely unbelievable to Elisha Gray. At this point in our story, Gray was employed by Western Union, but they then brought in Thomas Edison, and together they began to build their own telephone system. The problem with the original sound transmitter, that's to say the problem with the pin in acid, is of course that it was extremely impractical. Could you imagine making a telephone call right now by speaking into a beaker with an acidified solution in the bottom that's got a pin hanging from a bit of thread on it? Western Union hired the very best inventors to try to solve this problem, to solve the problem of converting a sound wave into an electrical signal. Now, Edison invented what can only be described as a really beautiful piece of machinery. I certainly called it that in my book, Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. It became known as the carbon button. If you're as old as I am, you might remember unscrewing the mouthpiece of an old Baker-like telephone. Inside was a small circular disc, a little bigger than a 2-pence piece, but not much bigger. That was the carbon button. When you speak into the carbon button, the carbon elements, shift ever so slightly. This changes the resistance of the electrical current passing through it, and that, of course, creates a unique electrical signal. So it did exactly what the pin in electrified water did, but of course it was smaller, more practical, resilient, and it fit neatly into the mouthpiece of a telephone handset. And because it was so small, people started to call it micro. In other words, this little piece of kit became known as the microphone, and the name stuck. Western Union had, in other words, taken Bell's patented device and were illegally developing technologies on top of it or around it as they systematically looked to replace parts of his patented system that were impractical. In the year that all of this was happening, Alexander Graham Bell and Mabel travelled to England for a well-deserved break. They were married, and on that trip, Alexander Graham Bell demonstrated the telephone to anybody, of course, who was interested, including Queen Victoria herself. I do wonder if he told her the story about how he sang to Thomas Watson, God Save the Queen. He'd heard from the United States about the work at Western Union. First he was annoyed, and then he was angry. Not only were Western Union infringing his patents illegally and therefore damaging his business, they were bringing his reputation into disrepute. According to them, Bell was a liar. Bell was a cheat. The key technology that made the telephone work had been stolen from Elisha Gray. Mabel and Alec eventually arrived back with their baby, the 5-month-old Elsie. On the docks, Alec heard an unexpected voice. Well, why was it unexpected? They'd landed in Quebec City. "Alec, Alec," the voice shouted. Alec broke into a smile when he saw that the voice was connected to his longtime collaborator and friend, Thomas Watson. The smile quickly gave way to an angry frown because Alexander Graham Bell wanted to know what on earth was Thomas Watson doing at the docks in Quebec City. Obviously, Gardiner Hubbard wanted him back in Boston. The Patent Office needed a statement from Alexander Graham Bell, and he had to prepare for a court case. Gardiner Hubbard had called Western Union's bluff and had begun court proceedings when Alec and Mabel were away in England. They, of course, that's to say Watson and Hubbard, had made their statements, and now they waited for Alex. Alexander Graham Bell, of course, indecisive, conflict avoidant, fearful of paperwork, said at this point he was happy to give up the telephone business. He did not want to appear in court. He would leave the fight to other people. But there was no way those other people, Hubbard and Watson and their business associates, could win that court case without the help of Alexander Graham Bell. For the sake of the Bell Telephones Company, they had to win that suit against Western Union. Why did they have to win? First of all, Thomas Edison had invented the carbon button. In other words, Western Union were taking practical steps to make the telephone scalable. However, point number 2, Western Union were also able to use all of their existing infrastructure. They had telegraph lines that ran alongside railway lines. Point 3, their very deep pockets allowed them to discount their rates. And point 4, the rumour had it that they were cutting the Bell Telephone Company's wires. So for every moment that passed between the resolution of the court case and the very day Alexander Graham Bell arrived back in Quebec City, the Bell Telephone Company's service deteriorated and Western Union's improved. How on earth did Western Union think they could get away with this? The truth is, with Elisha Gray on their staff, they obviously believed the key component in Alec Bell's patent had been stolen. Ever since Ezra Cornell had founded Western Union, it had carved out a monopoly position in telegraphy. They were, in other words, extremely rich. If a legal battle ensued, if that's to say the Bell Telephone Company dared to sue Western Union, William Orton felt that they could win in court, and of course they could throw almost endless financial resources at the case. Surely the Bell Telephone Company would not dare to challenge them. The other thing is, of course, that Western Union came to a similar conclusion that we've come to. They simply could not believe that Alexander Graham Bell could have beaten a skilled electrician like Elijah Gray. Unsurprisingly, once the American press got wind of this and the rumours circulating in Washington DC, they started to report on that as well. These factors all played into Western Union's calculated risk. January 1879 rolled around. Not long after Alec returned from Quebec City, the court case began. Poor Thomas Watson spent days and days preparing models and digging up the original telephone drawings and diagrams and designs. The case then proceeded slowly. But on April the 4th, events took a stunning turn. Bell's lawyers produced a scrunched-up letter that had been fished out of Alexander Graham Bell's waste paper basket. It was from Gray to Bell. It said, "I do not, however, claim even the credit of inventing it, as I do not believe in a mere description of an idea that has never been reduced to practice. Should be dignified with the name invention." Western Union's lawyers, they gasped in horror. If there was ever a smoking gun that indicated Alexander Graham Bell had won the race, this was it. But wait a minute, dear listener, just wait for one moment, pause for a second. Gray, when he went to shake Alexander Graham Bell's hand that day in the hotel, thought that he had genuinely lost the race. He thought that Alexander Graham Bell had beaten him to the punch with the component for converting sound into an electrical signal, and that Bell had built it into a system that actually worked. That was what the patent was based upon, but we know that the patent filed on the 14th of February was for a theoretical system, and that Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Watson did not get it working until March. Bell duped them, and Gray and his team seethed with anger. Their fury, though, led to agitation, which in turn cost them their credibility on the stand. In July, Western Union's lawyers cross-examined Alec. Charlotte Gray said that Alec was a formidable witness. He put his fantastic memory, his British accent, that beautiful baritone of his, and his remarkable skills as a teacher that had once upon a time let him articulate complex ideas, such as his father's visible speech system, to remarkable use. Bell's testimony and Elisha Gray's letter sank Western Union. They were forced to transfer all of their lines, switchboards, and all of their machinery to the Bell Telephone Company. In exchange, Western Union would receive 20% of receipts from all telephone calls, and Alec had 14 more years to exploit his patent. Victory, finally? No, not quite. The truth is, Alexander Graham Bell was impractical as an inventor, and he was even less practical as an entrepreneur. Very quickly, Hubbard and Bell, therefore, reached their limits. The telephone did not work over long distances, so the telegraph, which used a relay switch that Samuel Morse invented, worked right across the United States and Canada. Telegraphs were cheap. The telegraph was scalable, but signals on the telephone degraded quickly, and there was no effective amplifier to counter that. This explains why the first transcontinental telephone call did not happen until 1915. And, quite unbelievably, it only happened because Thomas Edison, when he was trying to invent the light bulb, noticed a strange glow at the end of one of his experiments. Edison patented this observation. Historians filed it away as the Edison effect. But soon, people would come to realise Edison had discovered, quite by accident, the flow of something that would soon be known as an electron. This observation led to what we call the vacuum tube. Vacuum tubes, which really are just light bulbs with an extra bit of wire stuck inside of them, are what were used to amplify a signal. The phone system therefore only worked after 1914 because of Thomas Edison's previous observation. Bell's lack of skills proved the newspapers right. He struggled to scale the telephone system and the Bell Telephone Company. In 1899, in a legal piece of jiu-jitsu, one of the Bell Telephone Company's subsidiaries acquired it. The subsidiary was the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, otherwise known as AT&T. AT&T would spend the next half a century avoiding the wrath of the Justice Department, and one way they did that was through the creation of something you may have heard of, Bell Labs. Through Bell Labs, and it must be said, a remarkable public relations team, history was rewritten. Not only the history of AT&T, but the history of Alexander Graham Bell. The real story is that Alexander Graham Bell, claimed by the Scottish, claimed by the Canadians, was compassionate and kind and a great teacher, but the shadow of his battle with Elisha Gray will always overshadow his integrity. Alex's real misfortune was that he fell desperately in love with his student, Mabel Hubbard. She happened to be related to a ruthless patent attorney. If Mabel was not deaf, and if Alec did not have remarkable empathy for the deaf, and if he wasn't a great teacher, and if tuberculosis had not struck his family, none of this would have happened, and he'd have never have stepped foot in Gardiner Hubbard's drawing room for that fateful tea party. But all of those things did happen. Alec's kindness and his ability as a teacher does not change the fact that Elisha Gray died in 1901 a broken man. A note was found in his possessions. It said, "The history of the telephone will never be fully written. It is partly hidden away and partly lying on the hearts and consciences of a few whose lips are sealed, some in death and others by a golden clasp whose grip is even tighter." The controversy over the invention of the telephone still rages today. Taking a charitable view, we could say this is an example of simultaneous invention. There are many throughout the history of technology. Two famous ones spring to mind. Leibniz and Newton both invented calculus at the same time. Centuries later, Robert Noyce and Jack Kilby both invented the microchip within months of each other. What is the explanation for simultaneous invention? Well, engineers, scientists, researchers, they read the same papers. In the case of Kilby and Noyce, they both understood what had been happening with the transistor. They both understood the problem of interconnecting all of those components. They then independently came up with a solution to it. Could that have happened in the case of Elisha Gray and Alexander Graham Bell? I personally don't think so. Setting aside for one moment the fact that Alexander Graham Bell was impractical and probably didn't have the skills to come up with the component that changed sound into an electrical signal, the fact alone that he submitted his patent application 4 hours before Gray's is just a stretch too far. It breaks credibility. It makes no sense, or if it does make sense, it's somehow the greatest coincidence, not just in the history of innovation, maybe in the history of planet Earth. And then, of course, there is the diagram. The diagram was identical and sketched identically. All of these things point to something, not exactly definitive, but certainly something that is a little bit, to say the very least, suspicious. Where does that leave us then, dear listener? We have a suspicious situation, we have diagrams that look identical, and we have historians fighting to this very day about the truth of what happened back then. Well, as you ponder that and as you let that settle into your subconsciousness, I think I'm going to answer a different set of questions. What does the story of the harmonic telegraph and Alexander Graham Bell mean to us right now? What lessons can we take away if we are, for example, leaders and managers who are trying to figure out generative AI or cloud computing? After all, the telephone itself was once upon a time on the cutting edge of technology. In other words, what management lessons can we take away from this? Well, I think I'd like to start with a very simple observation. Alexander Graham Bell had two careers. First, he was a school teacher, and only secondly was he an inventor. He learned from Helmholtz that the vowel sounds can be recreated with tuning forks. Back in Edinburgh, when he was a child, he learned that components, singular things, could be recomposed into systems, which, in that case, led to a toy or a device that could say, "Mama, Mama." Why is this important? It's important because in innovation, there is the concept of the adjacent possibility. This term, it was repurposed from biology in exactly the same way that Thomas Edison repurposed the word filament from biology. This term is all about the very next version of a thing, whether that's a biological thing or a technological thing. Just look at the harmonic telegraph. It was almost identical to the telegraph itself, except for this small device that changed a sound wave into an electrical signal. The insight happened in the mind of Alexander Graham Bell when he was in Canada. So the next possibility, or the next adjacent possibility, comes from a different way of thinking and a different way of seeing the world. My job as the co-founder of Container Solutions was to bring together a group of people who saw the world differently, who saw, in other words, the next adjacent possibilities. Once you've got a bunch of people like that, the challenge is clear. Create an environment where ideas can merge and join, and you as a team and you as a company can give birth to the next adjacent possibility. A lot of leaders and managers do not understand this. For most businesses, reinvention of either their product lines or their business models is simply not required. Most companies have an adjacent possibility within their grasp. They need to seek it out with logical, simple, and incremental next steps. Understanding the adjacent possibility and its relation to men like Bell who have got a broad range of experience is the first lesson that the harmonic telegraph teaches us. The second lesson is about multidisciplinary teams. We saw a good example of this in the previous episode. The conceptual Morse teamed up with the practical Vail. However, by the time we get to the late Victorian period, something has shifted. It is true, Bell had his practical right-hand man, Thomas Watson. He needed, though, something else: solicitors, capitalists, and specialists who could navigate Washington, D.C.'s patent landscape. In my experience, I have never seen a successful team doing anything substantial, whether building web-scale applications, cloud infrastructure, or generative AI systems right now, and I've never seen a successful tech company that was not composed of a multidisciplinary team. Once that team is put together, they need to be given the space and the time and the safety to find the next adjacent possibility. This is the second big lesson that jumps out of the story of the invention of the harmonic telegraph. What then is the third lesson? Well, the third lesson is all about simultaneous invention. Timing. When should you go? When should you accelerate? When should you keep quiet? These are all the questions that should be on the minds or the lips of technical leaders and managers who build machines for a living. It turns out that Alexander Graham Bell's timing was more or less perfect. Of course, there was lots and lots of skullduggery. The real point is this. Do you honestly think you are the only person in possession of whatever it is that you just invented? No way. Absolutely, as we say in Hull, no effing way. Right now, I speak to companies, and especially the executives in those companies, who have got ideas and inventions. They've got some sort of line of sight on the next adjacent possibility. But they seem to downplay or discount the fact that so too have their competitors. Many companies right now are the Leibnizes of the world. They cannot believe that Newton, in a different part of the world, has cooked up his own version of calculus. I meet executives all the time, and they are way too relaxed for my liking. Too relaxed because they think that what brought them here, what successes brought them here, will take them further. It is now time to wrap up the story of Alexander Graham Bell and the harmonic telegraph. And let me tell you, listeners, I love this story. It teaches us instantly not to be complacent because simultaneous invention is a real thing. It teaches us that we need multidisciplinary skills and teams. And of course, those teams should be made up of men like Bell and Elisha Gray who have rich life experiences. It is those rich experiences that allow them and allow us to see the adjacent possibility, to see what comes next. New York, 1915. An aged Alexander Graham Bell takes his position at one end of the circuit. Thomas Watson takes up his position at the other end. Alexander Graham Bell speaks. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." Watson replies, "But it will take me 5 days to get there now." Watson is in San Francisco. Together, they have just made the world's first transcontinental telephone call. The rest, as they say, is history. Thanks for watching today, and don't forget to like or subscribe if you want this stuff directly into your inbox. Now, as Alexander Graham Bell was inventing or stealing the harmonic telegraph, another young man set his sights on the world's first high-resistant light bulb. It is to that story of Thomas Edison that we turn to next.